This is All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. For today's edition of our American History Fridays, we focus on the life of Senator Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was the youngest of 9 Kennedy siblings. But after the assassinations of his brothers, Kennedy rose to be the hesitant leader of a family plagued by tragedy. He would go on to serve as a senator from Massachusetts for 47 years. He was elected 9 times. John A. Farrell spent years covering Kennedy as a reporter for the Boston Globe. His biography comes in at 752 pages. It's called Ted Kennedy, A Life. The book goes into great detail about Kennedy's legislative successes and failures, his drinking, and of course the tragedy at Chappaquiddick. We'll start with the history of Kennedy's family. His mother, Rose, was the daughter of Massachusetts political royalty. His father was the child of a local politician and businessman. He was proudly Irish Catholic. The family was rich and very powerful by the time Ted was born in 1932 in Bronxville, New York. And that's where we'll start with John A. Farrell, author of Ted Kennedy, A Life. John, when Ted Kennedy was born, Edward Moore Kennedy, on February 22nd, 1932, he was the youngest of 9 children of Joseph Kennedy and Rose Kennedy. By the time Teddy was born, John, what was the family's social status and financial status?
They were probably the wealthiest Irish-American Catholic family in the land, and probably one of the wealthiest families in the land. Joseph P. Kennedy, the famed Buccaneer father, had made a tremendous killing on Wall Street in banking, later in Hollywood. And by the time the Great Depression came along, he'd gotten out of the market, and he was more interested in political power than he was in business power. So young Ted came along, as you said, born to luxury, to an estate in Bronxville, New York, and very quickly ended up in London society as a toddler when his father became the first Irish Catholic ambassador to the court of St. James in London.
What was expected of Kennedy boys growing up?
As Rose Kennedy once confided to her diary, her children were perfect. They had been to the best orthodontists. They had been to the best schools. They were not allowed to gain weight. They were trained in skiing and tennis and golf and sailing and all the upper class sports. They were taught by relentless teasing and interrogation, friendly interrogation at the dinner table, that at any moment, if their dad was around, he might turn to them and ask them a series of questions about current events. So they were on top of the political and social news of the day. And the weakness in that system was that both parents traveled widely. By the time little Ted came along, they were somewhat estranged, in part because of Joseph's philandering. And so they had this relentless expectation, all the kids did, but it was based on sort of a shaky foundation, which may explain some of the neurotic behavior that at least several of the boys entertained as they went on through life.
You know, you've heard this common phrase that so much tragedy befell this family because of the sins of the father. What sins do people mean? What's something that the patriarch of the Kennedy family did that really fell outside the bounds of basic decency?
I think the demand for perfection, and then teaching the children, at least the boys, or especially the boys, that through a skilled public relations machine, you could manufacture truth, you could manufacture image, and dad's money will always get us out of any scrap. And so you had instances where John F. Kennedy, for example, would get in a car accident and he would turn to his friend Lem Billings and say, "You take the ticket because Dad'll never forgive me." Or Ted Kennedy getting caught in a cheating scandal in at Harvard and going to see his dad, and his dad getting furious, but then carving a path for him through safe military service in the Korean War to redeem himself and be able to go back to Harvard. So yes, there was anger, yes, there was reproach, but there was also a feeling you could get away with murder in that family.
John, you write that his mother worried that her son, her youngest son, and these are kind of her words, that he would become a fat and lazy person. That's what she saw possibly in his future. Yet later on in the book, you note that he felt in ways close to her. What impact did that relationship have on Ted Kennedy? This mother who could be, in one hand, very harsh, in my opinion, but on the other hand, did champion him.
Well, in investigative journalism, it's follow the money, and in biography, it's follow the mother. Nature and nurture. It really was an empty childhood, and Rose was very candid about it, and so was Ted's dad. I mean, and the brothers and sisters. There were many instances where, in later years, they would talk out loud to reporters or biographers or famous writers who were visiting the house, and they would just say, Ted's slow. We don't expect anything from him, and that gets back to you, and you begin to see yourself that way. You begin to see yourself as somebody who's not as worthy as the elder brothers. And I think that Rose, because she was around slightly more than Joe, probably had more of that impact. And she was, like I said, she was candid. Somebody, when John Kennedy won the presidency, a reporter from Time magazine interviewed Rose and asked her about 9 children, and she said, "Well, by the time the 9th one comes along, you don't want to go stand outside on a cold hillside while they take skiing lessons. You don't want to read the story that you've read, 8 times before." And so she confessed to the fact that he was somewhat ignored. But because he was the baby, because he was the youngest, there was a certain amount of pampering that went on by Rose and by his older sisters. So it was he could be both. You could say that he was both ignored and spoiled, if that's possible.
My guest is John Farrell. The name of the book is Ted Kennedy, A Life. He played the part. He had a kind of a playboy-like existence before going to Harvard in 1950. In all honesty, was Ted academically gifted enough to get into Harvard on his own, or was this a legacy/bought seat?
I think that in those days, there was a segment of the Harvard entering classes that everybody knew were there because, great granddad had gone to Harvard, and granddad had gone to Harvard, and dad had gone to Harvard, and now young Ted is going to go to Harvard. And whether or not their parents contributed a great deal of money or not, or whether your name was Roosevelt, Lodge, or Kennedy, there was a sizable group of that class, segment of that class, that were there because of social and social reasons, tradition, wealth, and influence. And so it wasn't a great scandal that Ted Kennedy, who had sort of mediocre marks in elementary school and better marks at Milton Academy, where he finally sort of stabilized his academic career, could get into Harvard. And by the time that he graduated, given the fact that he had taken 2 years off and matured a great deal, he had worked his way up to above the middle of his class, so he could do the work as well.
Ted Kennedy this is part of the legend of Ted Kennedy, is that he had a friend take a test for him. Why did he have a friend take a test for him at Harvard?
There was a definite character flaw of being rich and spoiled in all the Kennedy boys, I believe, that made them think, as many of their associates said in later years, that there were rules for Kennedys and there were rules for everybody else. And in Ted's case, he dearly wanted to play football. Jack and Joe and Bobby had played football, and as it turned out, Teddy might have been the best football player in the family. But if he failed his Spanish exam as a freshman, he was not going to be allowed to play football in the following fall. And so he panicked to an extent, asked a friend, a really stupid scheme. He asked a friend to take the test for him, and as if the proctor of the exam would know when this guy handed in the exam that this was not Ted Kennedy. But they had done it once before that semester, so they thought they could get away with it again. And he was caught, and he was kicked out for 2 years, in which, as we said, he went to spent the Korean War era at a very nice billet in Paris in the NATO Honor Guard, where he learned to enjoy wine and women, and came back quite a different, mature individual when he re-entered Harvard, somewhat chastened by the experience, but also with the realization again that Dad can get us out of these things, and no penalty will be too long lasting. He was not a great student at Harvard, but neither was he a stumblebum. He was not a great analytic mind, but neither was he dumb. He was he was an above average smart guy with certain canny strengths, particularly in politics, and they served him well over the years. And finally, boy, this is a long answer to a question, but finally, he recognized his limitations, and so he wasn't like other young men like Joe Biden, who felt that he had to inflate his academic record when talking with people later in life. Throughout all his life, he would make jokes about the fact that he needed all these brilliant people around him to help him, and just the fact that shows a certain amount of security in your own self and your own depth of knowledge, that you can joke about it. He was no genius, but he was no dummy either.
Ted Kennedy decides to marry a young woman his sister introduces him to, Joan Bennett. She's 22. He is 26. Why was she considered a good wife choice for a young Kennedy man?
Well, she was beautiful. She was smart, and she went to what was one of the premier Catholic universities in the country at the time, Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, where refined young Catholic women, and especially Irish Catholic women, were taught to have a social conscience, in addition to mastering the talents of wife and mom. And he went. It was an accidental meeting because John Kennedy was supposed to dedicate this gymnasium in the name of their sister, and he wanted to go to a football game, so he called Teddy, or had somebody from the office call Teddy and said, "Teddy, you're going to have to do this. You don't get a choice. I'm busy." And so it was Ted who went and made the speech at the dedication of the gymnasium, the Kathleen Kennedy Gymnasium, and there he ran into this woman, Joan Bennett. For both of them, it was like, okay, this is what young people our age and our class do at this time of life. It wasn't an impassioned love affair like Romeo and Juliet, where we're going to defy our parents and get married. It wasn't intense in that they saw each other all the time. He was out working on his brother's campaigns for long parts of that engagement. His dad had to pick out the engagement ring for them. And right before they got married, they realized this, and they spoke to each other, and they both had a case of cold feet. But by the time that happened, the word had gone out. The expectations were high. It was going to be this amazing wedding, and the Cardinal Spellman was going to perform the marriage rites, and they backed down. They couldn't stand up to their two fathers and say, no, it's not going to happen. We're not ready. And so they went ahead and went through it with it. And as Ted later said, I did it because that's what my brothers were doing. That's what guys my age seemed to be doing, rather than because they really wanted this life sealed to each other. She was immediately immersed in the spirit of competition. Had to be, as she famously told a reporter a few years later, now I can do everything that's required of me. I know how to ski. I know how to play tennis. I know how to sail. And he, in following the family tradition, almost immediately began to stray from his wedding vows. And so it was a hollow marriage all along. But there was some. I think there was some definite affection there, and particularly in the early years, where they thought about getting away from the strictures of the family and going out on their own, but eventually were tugged back.
You're listening to my full bio conversation with John A. Farrell, author of Ted Kennedy, A Life. After the break, Ted Kennedy decides to enter the family business of politics and also attempts to lead his family following the assassinations of his brothers. This is all of it. This is all of it on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. Let's continue my full bio conversation with John A. Farrell, author of the book Ted Kennedy, A Life. Early in his adult life, Ted Kennedy decided to enter into the family business of politics. He started by helping get his brother John elected to Congress, and then the presidency, which led patriarch Joseph Kennedy to pull a move that could both help and hurt his youngest son's political career. Joseph Kennedy used his power to have a Kennedy ally installed in JFK's vacated Senate seat after he assumed the presidency. The idea was that Ted, who was 28 at the time, could run for it when he was old enough. And that's what he did at just 30 years old. That's where we continue with John A. Farrell, author of Ted Kennedy, A Life. Among Ted Kennedy's family duties in the family business was to help his brother John get elected senator. What skill did Ted Kennedy possess that was helpful to the Kennedy brand?
Well, he may have been the best looking. He certainly was the most hearty, athletic, hail fellow, well met, handshaking pal of the family. He could give a speech. He could go into a bar, down some beers, and make you feel like he was your buddy in ways that JFK and RFK could not. And it famously was said by his father that he had all the affability of an Irish cop, and by his brother John that Ted was the best natural politician in the family. So he had this good looks. He had the speech-making ability. He had this amazing drive built around family, not letting his brothers and his father down, working 20-hour days on the campaign trail as a candidate himself, and probably even longer when he was doing it for his brothers. And so that was the great appeal that he had. And it was the photos of those three together are astonishing. It's like there's one famous photo of them coming out of the surf. I guess it was in Florida, and it's like three Adonises coming out of the water and crossing the beach. Three amazingly handsome young men, and it all sort of fed into that time in our lives where the picture in American life where the picture magazines, Look and Life and the Saturday Evening Post, were doing these big, glamorous photo sprays. And that moved right on into the era of television, where somebody with charisma and photogenic looks like John Kennedy could prosper with this new medium, and right into today's age of celebrity, where JFK became the equivalent of Elvis, became Marilyn, became all the other one name iconic celebrities, and Teddy became one of them as well. So it's you had money, you had looks, you had that great ability to campaign and get along with the common guy, and it all made for a very potent politician.
Once JFK became president and installed RFK as Attorney General, who decided that Ted should be the senator from Massachusetts?
That was Joseph. That was Dad's decision. This was the point in life where Ted and his new wife Joan actually looked at each other and said, we had such a great time campaigning out west, which was his responsibility during the primaries. Maybe we pick up and we go to Arizona, or we go to Montana, and we start a new life there. And I get into politics and I try to run for a Senate seat on my own. And instead, Joseph, fulfilling a prediction he had made, believe it or not, when Ted was still in law school, said, no, now that one is president and one is going to be attorney general, the third son is going to be the senator, because we paid for that seat and it's ours, and we're going to keep it in the family.
So he does this by installing a placeholder in John's vacant seat to give Ted enough time to grow up and literally be old enough to run.
Yes.
And you say there was a team described as, quote, trying to make him a senator. What were his imperfections as a candidate, and we talked about his strengths. He was a good campaigner, but what were the imperfections?
The imperfections was that he was so young. He was so raw. He did not come across as a sophisticated candidate like his brother John, or as a tough, mean guy like Bobby. So he was seen as a lightweight. And in a very famous debate with Eddie McCormick, it was the 1962 Senate race. It was Teddy versus Eddie. And Eddie McCormick was the nephew of the Speaker of the House, John McCormick. So it was royalty, Irish royalty versus Irish royalty, and it attracted a tremendous amount of attention. But that was, it was the issue was Teddy Kennedy mature enough? He didn't have the record that Eddie McCormick had. Everybody said over and over again this was nepotism. He was being handed this seat because the Kennedys thought they were entitled to it, like a bauble that would just pass down around the family on Christmas night. And at a famous moment in this debate between Teddy and Eddie, McCormick said, Ted, if your name was Edward Moore, you wouldn't be here. That your candidacy is a joke. And for a moment, everybody thought the election was over. The attack was so lethal and effective in the hall. But on television and radio, it came across as bullying. And by this point, the Irish Americans of Massachusetts were so in love with the Kennedy family, because this was these were the champions who had shown how far the Irish could go in America, that they were ready to forgive Teddy of anything. And the verdict was that Ed McCormick had been mean, had been a bully, and so rather than tear down Teddy's candidacy, it actually helped promote it. And it was clear very quickly from the phone calls that were happening that night. And Ted Kennedy always told a story which appeared in the newspapers at the time, so I believe it's true. But the next morning he was campaigning. As he was shaking hands in a factory or bakery, one of the guys behind the counter said, "Hey, Kennedy, I understand that you've never worked a day in your life." And Teddy sort of braced himself for what the next line was going to be. And the guy said, "Let me tell you, you haven't missed a thing."
1 year into being senator, his brother, John F. Kennedy, is assassinated. Where was Ted on November 22nd, 1963? And then what was his job? What was he tasked to do after
He
John
was
died?
he was presiding over the Senate. Especially young senators on Friday afternoons get to do that onerous duty of sitting up there with the gavel while one person reads from constituent correspondence into the congressional record. And an aide came in and whispered to the senators that were in the chamber and finally came up to the podium and said, your brother, the president, he's been shot. His immediate task was to try to get through to the White House, which, of course, anybody who was alive at that time remembers that the country was just absolutely stricken in a way. It only happened twice in my life, maybe John Kennedy's assassination and 9/11, and maybe before that, you'd have to go back to Pearl Harbor to get the impact of those hours of that afternoon and of the days that followed. Because this young president that had been learning on the job, but had captured America's imagination, captured the feeling that the country was stagnant and had to get going again, had been stricken down by this, crazed lunatic assassin, and there was no reason for it. So it was twice the catastrophe, and of course Jacqueline Kennedy reacted marvelously. Ted's role that weekend was to be a supporting character, was to wear a mourning clothes, go up and be the one who had the tough duty of telling his father that JFK had been shot, which he took a while to do because he wasn't sure that his father, who had already suffered a stroke, that this news would not kill the old man. And then to march in the funeral, march in the parade, because he was the second oldest Kennedy brother. The oldest, Robert, took over the Klan, and Ted was assigned things that Robert, who was completely stricken by JFK's death, couldn't do. And so it fell to Ted Kennedy to be the person who had to raise the money for the Kennedy Library. And also he had to be the one who went and was briefed on the Warren Commission findings on the assassination and had to deal with things like that Bobby couldn't deal with. And given what followed with Robert's assassination 5 years later, I thought it was very significant that everybody paid attention to Robert as being the person who was so depressed, so stricken by grief when John was killed, and nobody paid a lot of attention to how Ted felt. He was supposed to be happy-go-lucky Ted again. He was supposed to bounce back, and there wasn't a lot of recognition then or in 1968 to the fact that you had lost two of your most beloved brothers and the two people that matter the most to you in this life in horrible public executions. And yet the best that could be said for you was, oh, well, he toughed it out. He went sailing or he walked the beach. Because, again, there was no tradition of dealing with feelings in that family.
Let's talk about Vietnam. We could talk about Vietnam for another hour and a half. But specifically, I wanted to talk about Ted Kennedy and the refugee crisis and his role in highlighting the pending refugee crisis. How did he come to this issue?
Well, it was a Kennedy Johnson administration decision to escalate. John Kennedy left office with maybe 16,000 troops in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson upped that to 500,000 troops before the two younger Kennedy brothers came out in full opposition to the war. And Ted Kennedy's was looking for issues. He had inherited this little-known subcommittee on refugees and saw this as a way to contribute to the effort by being a helpful critic of the war. And he would go over there and he would look and say, well, we don't have enough hospitals for the civilian population. And he would come back, and Robert McNamara, who was a former Kennedy administration defense secretary and was now Lyndon Johnson's defense secretary, would say, oh, okay, we're going to build some hospitals. And
he's Mr. Fog of War.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And so the initial impact that he had was how can we win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people better to help win this war? Then all of a sudden, as it became clear very quickly by the end of 1965 that there were serious problems in the war, more and more it was impossible for this little subcommittee to ignore the testimony and ignore what they were seeing when they were going over there, that there were serious issues about what we were doing, and that bombing and escalation was not going to be an answer. And he became more of a vocal critic. He also took another issue by being the champion for draft reform, the liberal champion for draft reform in the Senate. And so he sort of had those two little side tracks, while Robert Kennedy, who was also a U.S. Senator now, became the more pronounced geopolitical critic of the administration. But in some ways, because Ted Kennedy was doing this more obscure work and was coming across as an honest critic who didn't have immediate presidential ambitions of his own like Robert did, he got more credit for the work, and his criticism had a considerable impact, especially when Lyndon Johnson, who always liked Teddy better than Bobby, felt that Teddy was slipping away. That bothered Johnson to no end.
You're listening to my full bio conversation with John A. Farrell, author of Ted Kennedy, A Life. Next, what the author discovered in his reporting about the tragic accident on Chappaquiddick in 1969. That's after the break. This is All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. As a senator, Ted Kennedy achieved a lot. He helped establish the minimum wage, Medicare, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Pell Grants, and getting 18-year-olds the right to vote. And he ran a famous campaign for president in the Democratic primary against Jimmy Carter. But his political career was forever tied to that infamous car accident on Chappaquiddick in the summer of 1969. After his brothers were murdered, friends noted that Kennedy was out of control, working too much, driving too fast, and drinking heavily. Local reporters notified their bosses they could see trouble ahead. It came one night on the tiny island of Chappaquiddick off of Martha's Vineyard. Late one summer night, Kennedy drove a car off a small bridge and into the water. He left the scene having survived the crash. His passenger, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, did not. There's much more to what Kennedy did that night of the accident, as we'll hear now from my guest, John A. Farrell, author of the book Ted Kennedy, A Life. John, when did Ted Kennedy first start to show signs of having a problem with alcohol?
I think that he was always a boisterous party boy, so that was a background. He had a remarkable ability to drink a lot and bounce back the next morning, whether it's at a 7 a.m. tennis game or a 9 o'clock legislative hearing, and not show the effects of the night before's carousing. But I think it really became an issue for him after Robert's assassination in 1968. Again, he had never been prepared for this role. He was always supposed to be the sidekick, the happy-go-lucky younger brother who helped the elder brothers do great things. Now, all of a sudden, he had to hold this family together. He had to maintain the myth. He had to do everything. He had to be as good as they were in everything and better, because they were now mythic creatures, charismatic dream figures in American celebrity culture that he never could measure up with. And in that year before the events on Chappaquiddick, you see signs of him cracking up. He throws himself into his work. He drives fast cars. He and for the first time, he begins to appear in public intoxicated in front of the press. And remarkably, in the spring of 1969, you get reporters from Life magazine and Newsweek writing long memos to their editors saying, "Get ready. I don't know how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but he is heading for a crack up." And indeed, only 2 months later, on the island of Chappaquiddick, it did happen.
Yeah, what was the event that night, and why was Kennedy there?
It was a cookout. They wanted to keep the campaign crew together for a future presidential campaign if Ted decided to run in 1972. In 1968, they had had a similar day of sailing on a rented sailboat. They decided that had been successful, so they decided they'd do it again. Um, the only reason that uh, Joan Kennedy was not there was that she was had a difficult pregnancy and had to stay home in bed lest she lose the child. Um, the men were, and this caused some of the snickering. The men were almost uniformly older, drabber, and most of them were married. So it being the Woodstock summer, you can't say that there, and it being a political party with lots of drinks, you can't rule out completely that there could be some canoodling in the backyard bushes, but it was definitely not these were not a bunch of stewardesses as they were known, or fashion models flown in for Ted Kennedy's amusement.
John, do you have a copy of your book there?
I can get one. Hold on.
I'd love for you to read the account directly from your book of what happened that evening.
Kennedy asked Crimmins for the car keys. The old grouch was staying in the cottage that night, and happy to comply, he wanted to get to bed. By the reckoning of the witnesses, it was sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. when Kennedy and Kopechne slipped away. She left her room key and her purse behind. With Kennedy at the wheel, weary, emotional, after hours of intermittent drinking, the Oldsmobile came to a juncture and turned off the paved road, away from Edgartown and the ferry. Christopher Look, a deputy sheriff on his way home from work, would recall that he saw and approached a dark sedan at that intersection, which sped off down the washboard dirt surface of Dyke Road towards the beach. The moon had set, the night was black. Kennedy passed a house where the inhabitants, Sylvia Malm and her daughter, would recall a car moving fast towards the sea around midnight. Then Dyke Bridge was in the headlights with its iniquitous angle to the left. Kennedy slammed the brake pedal. The car left the bridge, flipped, and crashed roof first against the surface of the water. The driver's side window was open. The passenger side windows were shattered on impact. Instantly, the Olds filled with water and sank to the bottom of Poucha Pond. Automobiles did not have seatbelts in 1969, much less airbags. Mary Jo would have been tossed by the crash, forward and down, which was now toward the roof. Kennedy felt her thrashing beside him. She ended with her head in the footwell of the back seat, beside the shattered window through which she might have escaped. Perhaps she found a pocket of air, perhaps she never realized the car was upside down. Deep in black water, seeing nothing, Kennedy at least had the steering wheel to grasp and get oriented. He was terrified, felt himself drowning, dying. Experts later theorized that the crash sprung open a door, or that the torrent sweeping through the car helped push him through a window. He called out Mary Jo and made futile dives to the submerged car. I knew there was a girl in that car, and I had to get her out. I knew that, he'd recall. The current pushed him away. Defeated, he crawled onto the shore.
That was John Farrell reading from his book, Ted Kennedy, A Life. What happens next is Kennedy goes back to the party, gets help from two colleagues. When they get to the car, they realize this is over, that Mary Jo Kopechne is not alive. Kennedy claims he swam across the channel to the vineyard, but then he doesn't summon help. He waits until the next morning to go to the police. He checks himself into a hotel. Once he goes to the police, what was truly unusual about the way the investigation was handled?
Well, let me talk first about this decision that he made, because I think that one thing that's overlooked in the reviews of the book is that observers, reporters, investigators have always assumed that Kennedy's pattern of action that night was an attempt to crudely evade responsibility, to cover up for the crime. And in this book, for the first time, we have it from his own mouth. We have Ted Kennedy telling his sister Jean Smith, who then tells the historian and family friend Arthur Schlesinger, that Ted confessed to her that he had indeed behaved in this craven manner, had gone back to try to establish some sort of alibi in his hotel in Edgartown and pin the blame on either Mary Jo or maybe somebody else from the party and get off scot-free. And in the book, I describe this as a terribly craven behavior. When it finally is clear after 10 hours of leaving this poor girl in the car, of which even Rose Kennedy criticized her son, he finally goes to the police station, and the police department there, it's a small town, summer vacation spot, they're in awe of the fact that this has happened. They're all good Democrats. There was no need to orchestrate a clumsy legal cover-up. They just behaved as if they were so overcome in awe of what had been dropped in their laps that they weren't thinking like real prosecutors or real police chiefs, and allowed things to proceed in a way that it looked like not enough, the right questions were not being asked. And that caused a reaction the other way, so that you had three extraordinary legal proceedings that never would have happened in a regular manslaughter case, and flipped it back the other way and kept the case alive for another 9 months. So if there was a cover up, it was the worst cover up ever, because it resulted in an inquest that had devastating results for Kennedy and kept the issue alive for an entire year.
John, from your reporting, why didn't Chappaquiddick end his career?
Well, if you go to the photo array in the book, there's a photograph of him campaigning for office in 1970, immediately after Chappaquiddick. And there's a picture of four nuns, and they're holding a sign that says, "God bless our Ted." And standing next to Ted is Joan, being the good wife, smiling. And I think that picture sort of says it all. The Massachusetts elected him and reelected him and reelected him and reelected him and reelected him, because I think that they had so much of an emotional investment in the Kennedy story, the Kennedy charisma. They just loved that family so much for so long that they could forgive so much. And he campaigned hard, of course. He was incredibly lucky in that his arch enemy, Richard Nixon, on the day that the inquest report, the Chappaquiddick inquest report, was released in the spring of 1970, Richard Nixon invades Cambodia. And it would take something like that in the middle of the Vietnam War to drown out something like the Chappaquiddick inquest, but son of a gun, it did it. And so a great irony of history that Richard Nixon may have helped Ted Kennedy survive that particular week and the damage of that inquest report, which said that he was basically he should have been charged with manslaughter.
Once Ted Kennedy decides to run for president, he poses a challenge to President Jimmy Carter. He and Jimmy Carter did not like each other. And that's sort of mild. They weren't just rivals. They really didn't like each other. What was behind that?
Part of it, I think, was cultural. It wasn't just Carter. It was also Carter's Georgia Mafia. And the sort of Georgia pious Baptist tradition that Carter showed was not the Irish Catholic tradition that Tip O'Neill or Ted Kennedy espoused. And so Carter came in as a reformer, and that did not sit well with the Democrats in Congress, who thought that with this big majority after Watergate, that they should be paving the streets back home with gold. And here's this guy from Georgia talking about, I'm never going to lie to you. We have to tighten our belts on energy. We need a balanced budget. There were political differences as well. But I think, I'm very harsh on Jimmy Carter in the book. And I think part of that is that when Jimmy Carter decided he was going to run for president, which was back around 71 or 72, he decided that Ted Kennedy was the obstacle that was the biggest obstacle in his way. And so therefore, from the start, saw Kennedy as an obstacle that had to be removed, that had to be pushed aside, that had to be defeated, that had to be cut down in size. And even when Ted did not run in 1972 or 1976, I think that it's human nature that once you define you have a political enemy, that over time you develop a personal contempt as well. I think that it was, if you think about it, in terms of what a good Democrat and a good liberal should have done after Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter and the Iranian hostage crisis of the fall of 1979 allowed the country to unite behind Carter and allowed Carter to whip Kennedy in New Hampshire, the Iowa caucuses in the New Hampshire primary. And it was clear that Ted Kennedy could not win. He should have gotten out instead of continuing to fight a Democratic president and opening the door to the conservative wave that took over American politics for another 20 plus years. So you have to definitely pin some of that on Kennedy, but on the other hand, Jimmy Carter was sort of priggish, and it's hard to say, and it's hard to look at the image he has crafted since he left the presidency, but he was also hypocritical. He was definitely a holier-than-thou guy who had two standards, one for his own when it came to protecting brother Billy, who ran into trouble that year, and another for other politicians who he could look down on with contempt because they were pals. They were politicians like Kennedy and O'Neill.
Ted Kennedy would succumb to brain cancer in 2009. He is remembered in most of the obituaries as Lion of the Senate. Do you believe he's someone who really believed or embodied noblesse oblige?
That's not how I would think of him. I think of him as a very flawed human being, an insecure human being for all the bravado, brought up with traditions rather than noblesse oblige, brought up with traditions of a defense of the underdog from his Irish American immigrant heritage. One of the guys I interviewed had worked for all three brothers, and he said they were well-fed underdogs with pretty good bite, and I thought that was the best definition of the Kennedy brothers. Yes, they were well-fed. Yes, they were brought up on Hyannis and went to Harvard and had the best orthodontist and the best roast beef dinners in the middle of that any family could hope for in the middle of the Depression. But on the other hand, they had that streak of kinship with what the average Americans or what working family and what minorities and the downtrodden in America had to face, and were willing to fight for him. And I think people saw that. It's why they write songs about him. It's why they write so many books about him. It's why they return that, and the tragedy that accompanies them, that makes it a Shakespearean story. I think is why they are an eternal fascination. It's just, I've had so many people, send me emails and said, I just finished the book. What a story. And it is. It's just his life is just an amazing story of this flawed human being thrown into history and ending up doing good things.
John A. Farrell's biography is called Ted Kennedy, A Life. It was our choice for full bio in today's installment of American History Fridays. And that is all of it for today. All of it is produced by Kate Hines, Jordan Loff, Simon Close, Zach Goddard-Cohen, El Malik Anderson, and Luke Green. Megan Ryan is the head of live radio. Our engineers are Juliana Fonda, Jason Isaac, and Anthony Messina. Luscious Jackson does our music. I'm Allison Stewart. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you. Have a great weekend. I'll meet you back here on Monday.